There's a number that keeps me up at night, 8.2. That's Australia's median multiple right now, meaning the median house price is 8.2 times the median annual household income. To put that in perspective, anything above 5 is classified as severely unaffordable by international housing standards. Australia is not just in that category, it is smashing through the ceiling of it. And yet, the real estate agents are still sending out glossy brochures. The government keeps announcing schemes that make the problem worse, and the mainstream media keeps calling it a resilient market. But here's what nobody is actually telling you. One Australian city is already showing the first cracks, and the warning signs were there for years. Let's start with the data, because the data doesn't lie even when politicians do. Sydney's median house price as of right now sits at $1.75 million. That is 13.8 times the median household income. The only city on planet Earth with a worse affordability ratio than Sydney is Hong Kong. Let that sink in for a moment. A city in Australia, a country that likes to brand itself as the land of the fair go, is less affordable than Tokyo, London, New York, and almost every other major city on the face of the earth. And we're not talking about a brief spike. Home values across Australia have surged by roughly 47% since March 2020. 47% in 5 years. Meanwhile, wages didn't come close to keeping up, and the cost of servicing a new mortgage has climbed to 45% of household income. The global stress threshold, the point at which economists say households are in genuine financial danger, is 30%. Australia blew past that a long time ago. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because while everyone is fixated on Sydney and its jaw-dropping price tags, the city that is genuinely showing systemic fractures right now is Melbourne, and the establishment doesn't want to have this conversation. Melbourne has been the quiet underperformer in Australia's property boom. While Brisbane was surging, while Perth was going absolutely parabolic, while Adelaide was posting double-digit gains, Melbourne was going backwards. Home values in Melbourne today still sit 0.7% below the record highs set all the way back in March 2022. Not 0.7% below last month's peak, below a peak from 3 years ago, in a property market that everyone tells you only goes up. And the reasons why are where this story gets genuinely dark. Victoria's government came out of COVID absolutely drowning in debt. State debt that ballooned to extraordinary levels. And how did they decide to pay it back? They went after property investors. Hard. Land taxes were hiked. Surcharges were introduced. Legislation was rewritten to increasingly favor tenants over landlords. The effect was predictable to anyone who wasn't actively trying to ignore it. Investors fled. Not slowly, they fled in droves. Rental properties were pulled from the market en masse. Melbourne saw its rental stock decrease by 21,700 properties in a single financial year. 21,000 homes just gone from the rental pool. Vacancy rates in Melbourne collapsed to a historic low of 1.07%. For context, a balanced rental market is considered to be somewhere around 2 to 2.5%. Melbourne was running at less than half of that. So what happens when you drain rental supply that aggressively? Rents skyrocket. And when rents skyrocket beyond what people can pay, and remember, we're already at a point where low-income earners, international students, and single-parent families are spending over 30% of their income just on rent. People leave. Essential workers start making the calculation that Melbourne simply isn't worth it anymore. And when essential workers leave a city, the city itself begins to quietly hollow out. But here's the part that the property spruikers conveniently leave out of their YouTube videos and their weekend supplements. The construction sector in Victoria is in genuine crisis. New dwelling completions are projected to hit their lowest point in a decade. The number of dwellings under construction across the state has fallen to 68,100, down 6% from the previous year. Melbourne's apartment approvals have plummeted to a near 20-year low. 20-year low. in a city that desperately needs more housing. Construction costs have surged by up to 40% since the pandemic. Labor shortages are crippling the industry. 85% of builders report difficulty finding suitable workers. The construction sector needs an additional 130,000 workers just to tread water. And material prices? Up more than 35% with minimal signs of coming back down. So let's map this out clearly because the picture becomes terrifying when you connect all the dots. You have a city where property prices have been falling relative to the national trend. You have a state government that effectively chased investors away with aggressive taxation. You have a rental market at historic lows for supply. You have a construction sector that cannot build its way out of a paper bag right now. And you have a population of residents who are already, by the IMF's own classification, in severely unaffordable housing territory. This is not a recipe for a soft landing. This is a recipe for a pressure cooker. And now here's the government's response. What has Canberra done to fix Australia's housing crisis? They expanded the first home buyer scheme, the 5% deposit guarantee. Sounds generous, right? The International Monetary Fund has explicitly called for this scheme to be withdrawn because it drives property prices up. The IMF, the global institution that exists to assess economic stability. They looked at Australia's housing policy and said, this is making it worse. And the Albanese government expanded it anyway, made it demand-driven with no cap on places, which means any eligible buyer who can scrape together a 5% deposit can access it. And they're all going to use that leveraged buying power to bid prices even higher in a market that is already critically undersupplied. It's not a housing policy. It's a vote-buying exercise dressed in the language of compassion. Meanwhile, the big four banks, Commonwealth, Westpac, NAB, and ANZ, are sitting on over 72% of the country's banking assets and accounting for more than 90% of lending. An Australia Institute study found these banks extract around $200,000 in profit from a typical 30-year owner-occupier mortgage, $200,000 per loan. And the government is literally guaranteeing more of these mortgages with taxpayer money, while the banks pocket the profit and carry almost no risk if the market turns. The system is not broken. It is working exactly as designed, just not for the people who are being crushed by it. Now, back to Melbourne specifically, because we're not done. The RBA raised interest rates again at its February 2026 meeting. Yes, raised. While everyone was hoping for cuts, the central bank looked at the data and tightened. Higher rents, insurance premiums, and energy costs were still feeding through the system. And with the labor market still resilient, the RBA didn't have the breathing room to ease off. What does that mean for Melbourne? It means the hundreds of thousands of households already spending 45% of their income on mortgage repayments are now spending more. And Melbourne, as one of the most rate-sensitive markets in Australia, feels that more sharply than almost anywhere else. The unit sector in Melbourne is already in outright distress. While house values have shown some resilience, the unit market continues to drag the overall numbers down. Melbourne has the weakest performing high-density segment of any Australian capital city. Buyers are avoiding it. Investors who haven't already fled are avoiding it. And new supply of apartments, which is what the city genuinely needs, has collapsed to levels not seen in 20 years because developers cannot make the numbers work when construction costs have surged 40% and presale prices aren't high enough to cover them. Now, and this is important because I want to be straight with you rather than just sensationalist, is Melbourne going to experience a dramatic, sudden crash? The kind where prices fall 30 or 40% overnight? Probably not. Australia's housing market has structural features that make that kind of collapse difficult. Banks apply significant serviceability buffers. The rental market is so tight that forced selling would need to become truly widespread before prices broke decisively lower. Population growth, even as it moderates from its post-COVID peak of 662,000 people per year, is still running at over 360,000 annually. That's real demand. That doesn't disappear. What's actually happening, and what is genuinely more insidious than an outright crash, is a slow-motion fracturing. Melbourne is becoming a city of two economies. On one side, you have the baby boomers and existing property owners sitting on vast equity, snapping up larger apartments as they downsize, competing in prestige markets that are setting record prices, completely insulated from the affordability crisis because they're already on the right side of it. And on the other side, you have an entire generation, millennials, Gen Z, young professionals, essential workers, who are being structurally, permanently locked out, not temporarily priced out, permanently locked out. Mortgage broker Rebecca Jarrett Dalton, who works with first home buyers every day, put it bluntly: intergenerational wealth is now the dividing line. If your parents own a home, you can access the market. If they don't, you are on your own and the door is closing. By 2026, a solo purchaser earning the average Australian full-time wage cannot buy a typical house in any Australian capital city, not one. And they cannot buy a median-priced apartment in Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, or Perth either. The average house price in Australia's capital cities is now equivalent to over 8 years of average earnings. In the 1950s and 1980s, that figure was 3 years. Think about what that shift means for every social system downstream of housing: superannuation, retirement planning, family formation, mental health, community cohesion. All of it gets deformed when the fundamental act of securing shelter becomes an 8-year income problem. The government spends more on tax breaks for landlords than it does on social housing, homelessness support, and rent assistance combined. The Australian Council of Social Service puts the cost of landlord tax concessions at $12.3 billion in 2025 alone, $12.3 billion to subsidize people who already own property, while people sleep in their cars. So where does this leave Melbourne, and where does it leave you? Melbourne is the canary in Australia's property coal mine, not because it's the most unaffordable, but because it's the place where the political chickens are coming home to roost first. The investor exodus triggered by Victoria's tax regime created a real-world experiment in what happens when you remove rental supply from a market without solving the underlying supply problem. The answer, it turns out, is exactly what economists told you it would be: crushing rental stress, population displacement, and a construction industry too battered to respond even if policy reversed tomorrow. There is no quick fix here. The Housing Australia Future Fund has supported funding for 18,650 homes in its first 2 rounds. Sounds decent, but only 889 have actually been completed. Australia doesn't need more press releases. It needs more homes. The intent is right. The execution is a disaster. And until the gap between what politicians announce and what actually gets built closes dramatically, and it won't close dramatically in an environment where construction costs are up 40% and tradies are impossible to find, the pressure will keep building. Melbourne is crashing first, not in a single dramatic moment that makes the 6 o'clock news, but in the slow, grinding, generational way that actually does the most damage. And if you're sitting in Sydney or Brisbane or Perth right now thinking this doesn't apply to you, look at the fundamentals. Look at the debt-to-income ratios. Look at the serviceability buffers that banks are already applying. Look at what happens if unemployment ticks up even 2 or 3%. The same forces that are fracturing Melbourne are present, to varying degrees, in every Australian capital city. Melbourne is just the first domino. They're not telling you this because too many powerful people benefit from the current arrangement. The banks profit, the existing homeowners profit. The government papers over the crisis with schemes that make it worse. But the data is there for anyone willing to look at it honestly. And now you've looked at it. What you do with that is up to you.